The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello everyone and a warm welcome to today's webinar that's on mainstreaming health research through journalism. My name is Banya and I'll be moderating today's session with Devleena. Today's webinar is again a collaboration between IA-IAVI and the Wellcome Trust DBT India Alliance. This webinar is our effort to strengthen South-South collaboration and support cross-learning and knowledge exchange between India and Africa. We would also like to thank AVAC and USAID and the Casper Network for all the support they have provided to this webinar. We are very pleased with the overwhelming response that this webinar has received once again, and would like to thank you all for your time and interest and for joining us today. It might take us a few minutes before we settle down, as people will keep joining in and you might hear some background noise. Nonetheless, we will try to make it as smooth as possible for everyone. So before we start, we have a few housekeeping announcements for you. Today's webinar will be recorded, and we will try to make the recording available to everyone who has registered for this webinar. We would love to hear from you during today's presentation. So if you have a question for our speaker, please feel free to send it through the question box. You can see the question box on your control panel. We will also be answering questions during the Q&A session at the end. So if you have any questions, you can also and want to speak, you can hit the raise hand button on the control hand panel. So without any further ado, I would like to kick off the things by welcoming Devleena to help us understand why this topic is critical and why we are discussing this today in today's webinar.
Thank you so much, Banya, and a very, very warm welcome to everyone who's listening to us and who's joined us. Public health and science are embedded in virtually every aspect of our modern life. There is an increasing need to integrate information from science in our personal values and in our day-to-day choices and decisions, especially with respect to health and lifestyle choices. For many years, as we know, media has remained a key source of information, playing the role of agenda setter as well as informing many of our daily choices. However, at a time when rumors, fake news, and pseudoscience regularly end up stirring media hysteria among general people, the job of accurately and appropriately conveying health-related scientific findings has become significantly more important. The large-scale and complex nature of challenges that health science journalists face today are such that they cannot be actually tackled by an individual or organization alone. The task requires the entire fraternity of health journalists, scientists, researchers, and civil society groups to work together and come up with appropriate responses to these challenges. However, what we have often observed is that these critical stakeholders themselves don't engage in a meaningful manner. And we have had scientists and researchers fearing their research would be misquoted and therefore refrain from media interaction, and are just happy with publishing their work in academic publications. On the other hand, we have also heard from journalists that their engagement with health scientists have been reduced to a mere PR exercise, and they have been left to scout for information on their own. And that's where we thought this webinar would be helpful in breaking these silos and help us understand what exactly do journalists need and what can public health professionals offer. I would like to invite Mia Malan, who joins us all the way from South Africa. Mia is the health editor and heads the Health Journalism Center, Bhekisisa. The center runs critical thinking forums on health issues and health journalism training. Mia started her career as a journalist in 1995 and has over 20 plus years of experience. She is specialized in narrative science journalism and is the recipient of more than 30 plus African journalism awards, including CNN Multi-Choice African Features Journalist of the Year in 2016, Discovery Health Journalist of the Year in 2013, and many more. She was also a Knights Journalism Fellow and was a lecturer at the Rhodes University. Mia, the floor is open for you, and we really look forward to hearing you today.
Thank you very much, Banya, and thank you, Devi, and thank you for the opportunity, and thanks to everyone joining the webinar. Yes, I'm based here in Johannesburg. That's where I'm talking to you from. And I'm very happy that we have electricity. Our country has just been through severe load shedding and it has just been suspended. So I'm very happy that the electricity won't interrupt us this time around. As Banya has mentioned, I work for the Bhekisisa Center for Health Journalism. It's a center that I founded in 2013 and that reports on health and social justice issues. So I'm going to talk, as Banya mentioned, about mainstreaming health research through journalism, and to give you a little bit of an outline of what my presentation is about, I'm going to go to a slide that shows you that I'm first just going to tell you what is Bhekisisa. I always find it very hard to understand what people mean with examples if I don't know what a presenter represents or a little bit about the organization they represent. And then I'm going to talk about how the digital revolution has changed the news media and the way in which researchers communicate. It has the internet explosion has had such a drastic impact on how all of us communicate that it would be unwise to ignore the consequences of that and not address the way that we communicate to be synthesized with that. And then I'm going to end with giving you a few examples from Bhekisisa of how researchers have published their research through us and hopefully look at lessons that we've learned in doing that. So here is the slide, and you can see on the left side there is our team. It's about 2 weeks ago at a Critical Thinking Forum for World AIDS Day that we presented and hosted. In January, we will be adding 3 more team members. It will bring us to about 10 people in the office, but we also have another 10 that are not in the office, that are consultants or freelancers across Africa. You may wonder, what does Bhekisisa mean? It is a word in our biggest language in the country, is Zulu, and it means to scrutinize. So if a Zulu patient goes to a doctor and wants to be checked out really well, that patient will ask the doctor to Bhekisisa them. And that's where we got our name from, because we try to scrutinize health issues and look at them critically. So we don't really do day-to-day news at Bhekisisa. We do in-depth reports, and we specialize in something called evidence-based and solutions journalism. Now, you would want to think that all journalism is evidence-based, but that is actually a very specific type of journalism where you would refer to peer-reviewed research in your studies. So I'm quickly going to go to the slide after this one and then come back just to show you what I mean with evidence-based journalism. So this is a screen grab of a story that we recently did on sex education, a new sex education program in South Africa for schools. And all the blue bits are referring to peer-reviewed studies, or if they weren't published in a peer-reviewed journal, the statistics that we use would come from a reputable organization. So for instance, in the first paragraph there, you can see that we've quoted Statistics South Africa, which is our government service that look at statistics in the country. And a little bit down there in the last paragraph, you'll see that we refer to PLOS ONE, which is an online journal, and we'll always talk about the year in which the research appeared and the type of study that it appeared in, and then also look at what it found. And so our reporters are trained in evaluating methodology so that we don't quote studies that are not really representative of what they found. And there's quite a mentoring process going on there between editors and reporters when we use those figures. I'm going to go back to the previous slide now to tell you more about what we do. So we do something that is called narrative journalism. We do in-depth narrative features, which is not just a story with a human face. It's something that has a storyline and has suspense in it. If it's really long, like 5,000 or 6,000 words, it's almost like a short story, but it's true and it's supported with statistics. And the solutions journalism that we do refers to a very specific type of journalism that evaluates one solution to a problem very critically. So if I could use an example in South Africa at the moment, it is initiations season in South Africa, where boys go up to mountains and get circumcised and it's a rite of passage and come out as men. And at the moment we are dealing with a lot of deaths that's happening with unsafe circumcisions. So an example of solutions journalism would be to perhaps go to a project where traditional circumcisers and medical circumcisers, medical male circumcision circumcisers work together, and to look at the pros and cons of that project, and also at the problem at the problem that it's addressing. So because journalism has changed so much in the online world, we no longer just write and publish in a newspaper, we also do short videos and podcasts and interactive maps, because our main way of distributing our content now has become online, as opposed to in 2013 when we were launched, when it was mainly through one newspaper. And we then give the content to those publishing partners that's on the slide, 3 of them in South Africa, and also sometimes to The Guardian in the UK. We give it to them for free, but what we get in exchange is we have publishing agreements. So we ask to be in the newsletter, and they must give us data of how many people have read the story and how long they read it for, and they must then also tell us, promote us on social media. And we try to reach decision makers, not really just the man on the street, because we want to influence policy. And between when we were launched in 2013 and today, our readership has grown from 3,500 people, monthly page views, to about 400,000 in September this year. And as Banya has mentioned, we also do conduct trainings for media. We, for instance, did trainings for journalists this year on reproductive health issues, and we also host public discussion forums that mostly focus on HIV and TB. You may wonder, why do we exist? Well, we are a non-profit, like many of the health research organizations that you work for is. And we are donor funded. Most of our funding comes from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, but we also receive smaller grants from the Open Society foundations and a few other smaller donors. Now, we ironically exist because in the past 2 decades, the economic model of the print media specifically has collapsed. The economic model was advertising, and with the digital revolution, Facebook and Google has taken most of that advertising, and the news media is really struggling to survive. So one way that it is looked at is donor funding, and it has opened up the way for organizations that aren't traditionally media funding organizations. So for instance, the Gates Foundation traditionally and typically funds health projects. It's opened up the way for them to fund specialist desks that would never be, and create opportunities for those issues that they advocate for to be covered more in the media. But when we started in 2013 as part of the health desk of the Mail and Guardian newspaper in South Africa, there was a really great need for us. So at the time, the newspaper couldn't afford a single health reporter. But because of donor funding, ironically, in this bad economic climate, because we got donor funds, when we left the Mail and Guardian in July this year and became an independent organization, we were the largest specialist desk at the newspaper. We were the only donor funded or intensively donor funded desk at the newspaper. And we were larger than the political desk, which is a strange situation for an investigative newspaper, and that was really because of donor funding. So I now want to talk a little bit about how the digital revolution has changed the way that we communicate. And the reason I'm talking to you about that is, even though you're researchers and not necessarily journalists, is because it's really changed the way that you communicate as well, and how you will communicate and what you can expect from the media. So on the right-hand side there, you will see a screen grab of a book of a guy called Alan Rusbridger. He is a former editor of the Guardian in the UK. And that book really explains how the digital revolution has drastically and dramatically changed how newspapers can make money and how they report on issues. Now, the one thing that he highlights is that because of the explosion, basically, of the internet, it has changed communication in the way that there's now a two-way or a multiple way of communication. So we are no longer able as the media to lecture people, to say, yes, the newspaper, read it, and then we tell you more tomorrow. And neither are you as researchers, because there's now social media where people can instantly react or take you on about what you've said. And there's also the situation where you can have your own website as a researcher, and you're no longer solely dependent on the media to distribute information. But one of the things that the internet has done, it has really disrupted concepts of authority. So it has meant that you as a scientist or epidemiologist or a pediatrician and a researcher no longer has all the power, because previously, where you could write an editorial in a peer-reviewed journal or an op-ed in a newspaper, and then people can only respond to it via letters, and an editor would sort of be the gatekeeper to decide which letters they will allow and which ones not. People now have their own printing presses. If you are on social media, you have your own printing press, and it has disrupted authority because your voice as an epidemiologist or a scientist no longer has more authority than someone who takes you on, who may have no scientific background, and they may even have more power if they have millions of followers. And that changes the way in which we communicate. And there's also no system to verify that information. So a very recent example of that is the case of measles vaccinations in Samoa. As you may have read in the news and as researchers have followed, there's an epidemic of measles in Samoa because of very low vaccination rates. It's as low as 40% as opposed to the 95% recommended coverage rate of the World Health Organization. And the government has now announced that there's a compulsory vaccination campaign and all sorts of emergency situations in the country. But at the same time, there are anti-vaxxer people who distribute or information that is inaccurate and ways to prevent or cure measles that are very damaging. For instance, on that screen, you can see the Facebook page of a guy called Edwin Tamasese, and he was recently arrested by the government because he promotes quack remedies such as papaya leaf extracts and vitamins to treat measles with. But the irony is that even though he's been arrested, he could still communicate as he was arrested, and he still has, everyone can have access to his information, because as you can see there on his Facebook page, he has more than 5,000 followers. He just after he was arrested, he was still on his phone, and he left this message that says, just before my phone gets taken, take these vitamins, dissolved in a quarter of a cup of water every 3 hours. This will save your kids. They will be on their feet in 16 hours. And this type of information is influencing people in Samoa as we speak, because many of those parents don't want to come out of their homes because they're scared that their vaccinations would be damaging for their children because of inaccurate information. And even though Facebook has committed to promoting vaccinations and try to limit the communication of anti-vaxxers on its platforms, this page is still open. I checked it again this morning, and this guy and his people who support him can still make comments on what he says. As you can see there on the screen, there's 5,000 comments that have been made, and that comment has been shared almost 2,000 times. So this is an example of how social media can really be damaging, but it's also a warning to all of us that if we don't use social media ourselves, we wouldn't be able to take these people on. We can't just say, oh, there's social media, it's not part of what I do, I'm a researcher. So as a result of media, this new definition of media where it's no longer reserved to just journalists and their publications, everyone can publish, people have changed their opinion of the media. So there's a study that at Oxford University, it's called the Digital News Report, that the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism that's based at Oxford does every year. And this year they found that fewer of half of the people trust the news media outlet that they choose, the main one that they choose for their own news, and that they also feel that the media has become, while journalists can break stuff, they don't make it meaningful to the audiences that they speak to, and that readers and consumers of media really miss that, and as a result often also avoid the news media. Now, the reason why I mention this to you as researchers is because it really should impact and should be taken in consideration on how you communicate your research. You don't want a journalist to portray it in a way that people aren't going to trust it, and you want to focus on making your research meaningful rather than just breaking the news of the research that you have found. So if we then look at whose research would get published the most in the news media, based on those findings and based on my experience, I would argue that it's people or researchers who are able to make their research meaningful to a non-scientific audience through op-eds, writing and publishing them, and interviews with journalists, but also those who have personal relationships with specifically specialist journalists. Now, I recognize that in many countries, not everyone have donor-funded units. I recognize that there are often situations where there are publications who don't have specialist journalists. My recommendation would be, if you have a limited amount of time to spend with the media, try and find the publications with a specialist journalist, or then if there aren't a specialist journalist at a publication, foster a relationship with one person, not with many. You'll get more out of that story than trying to have little bits of your research in little bits of publications that may not be accurate. And then something that I have found in my experience, and in many times when we train researchers in how to use the media, is that researchers would often have opinions on how the news media covers something, but not actually read it very regularly. If I would ask them, name a journalist, for instance, who covers this issue, sometimes they won't be able to come up with a name. And at Bhekisisa, we often get pictures for op-eds or for stories about a subject that we have just covered, and from researchers who haven't read it. So there's a lot of value in actually reading the news media, and I think it should almost be a requirement, just like it should be a requirement for me as a health journalist to keep up abreast with your research. And then, as we saw on the previous slides, that if you don't have social media skills, particularly on Twitter, because it tends to be a more influential social media system in terms of reaching policymakers and researchers and decision makers, and journalists use it very widely, then if you're not able to use social media to your advantage and follow what's going on there, it will be almost, in today's environment with online media, be impossible for you to promote your research actively. If you're not in touch with what other people think, which is what you will find, you will get that information from Twitter, then it would be, in this online digital disruption, it would be very hard for you to promote your research. And it would almost be short-sighted to argue that you don't have to be on there. If you're a researcher that feel uncomfortable to be on there, you should at least have communications people who check it out for you. I'm now going to talk about 2 examples at Bhekisisa of how we've worked with researchers and what the result was. And hopefully there are some lessons that you can learn. So Bhekisisa's most read story in the history of all our 7 years is a story that we did in the picture. there of people walking in the streets. That's a picture of a township called Diepsloot in the north of Johannesburg. It's a very large township with a significant population, and there's a very significant problem of rape and violence in the township. So there was a trial conducted called the Sonke Change Trial. The Sonke name comes from a research organization, actually an advocacy organization that also conducts research, that is called Sonke Gender Justice in South Africa. And the study focused on the science of male-female violence, and it looked at ways in which rape and violence could be addressed in the township. And we did a story, we followed the trial, and we contextualized it by doing a long-form story and looking at case studies of rape in the township. Now, the reason why I brought up this story is this study found where they interviewed up to 2,000 men in the township, and 56% of those men acknowledged that they have either raped or beaten a woman. So it's quite a severe, a shocking statistic. But of those people that have admitted it, 86% of them also acknowledged that they were abused themselves as children. So this story had a wide reach, as you can see there, that 70,000 page views, and the reading of the story continued long after it was published, and social media played a significant role, and it resulted in over 20 radio and television interviews in the South African media. That was not just done by us, that was also done by the researchers as a result of the story, and also helped to the organization they called the Green Door, the Rape Counseling Organization. If you would like to read the story, there's a hyperlink, as you can see there in the title of the story. I apologize that the pictures disappeared today after the electricity came back, so you'll be able to read the story, but you'll see that the pictures in between are not there, and I just couldn't fix it in time for today. But this study looked at if you bring men together and you try and change their notions of what it means to be a man, whether that could potentially be successful in bringing down rape rates. Now, there is a screen grab of the story on the right-hand side, and it was a long story, 5,000 words, and it contained many of that study's findings, but also of many other studies and statistics, and it was built around the story of one woman who was raped, who was very representative of the finding of the studies. Now, why would I talk about the study? Because the reason we did it is because researchers worked with us. It was very much a result of researchers getting in touch and communication officers. So we did a previous story on rape in Diepsloot where we worked with some of these organizations, and they then kept in touch with, I was the author of the story, with me to tell me there's going to be a follow-up leg to the study and they would really like to have it covered. The previous story was also a very long one, and it was also in the print media, over 4 pages in the Mail and Guardian. And because they helped me so significantly with that story, I was very eager to keep in touch, but it very much came from their side as well. And they really did follow what we did in between about rape in other areas of South Africa. I then, when I wanted to do the story, I needed a case study of a woman who was raped that is representative of their findings. Now, I could obviously not go into the township and just find the person myself, and they were then willing to allocate a field researcher to help me to find the person, but also when I went to interview her, to go along with me to make sure that everything was fine and it could help me to interpret. And in addition to that, they allowed me to attend their workshops that they had with men that was part of their study, the Sonke Change Trial, and to sit in as an observer so that I could get human bits that I could include in the story. Otherwise, the statistics and the study findings would just be meaningless and would also become too much to absorb for an average reader. And once I had done that, the lead researcher was actually from a big Wits university here in Johannesburg, was willing to come for additional interviews. So there was a huge time investment, and she was open to follow up calls, and it was reciprocal, because once the story was then completed, I was willing, because of all the time investment, to be very patient with her to review how the research was presented. She didn't look at the entire story, but the research bits, and to incorporate changes that related to accuracy and also sensitivities in the study that she requested for. Now, what could you learn from this interaction? Because this story has had massive impacts, and they've been able to use it as a fundraising tool with their donors, and they got a lot of exposure because of it. I would say that one lesson that they sort of shared that they learned was that it helps them to follow the work of specific reporters. It's too much to follow all reporters, to subscribe to the newsletters. They, for instance, subscribe to Bhekisisa's newsletter to see what we're doing. And it helps to invest that time in one reporter that they think can do an influential story, that's more valuable to them than what it is to invest time in many different reporters. If what you want is really to just get your research published, as a news story, then my advice would be to really rather write a very good press release that could hopefully be copied and pasted by what will be very junior reporters with a lack of money in newsrooms, and that is it. I would really recommend you write something that can literally be copied and pasted. But if you want to make it meaningful, to give it lasting value, then it's better to invest a lot of time with one reporter that you have a lot of faith in, or that you have a good personal relationship with. And train researchers in what journalists need. We need explanations of science, we need your time, and we need you to be available. And ultimately help them, if you're able to, find a human face to that story, because the impact becomes so much more significant. Now, what do you get in exchange? In place of this story, they got very, very prominent coverage. They could use the article for fundraising, for future projects. They got exposure in far more than just Bhekisisa and the Mail and Guardian, because many other media outlets followed up on this story because of the case studies, and because of the results of the study was made so meaningful. And they then got, there must be 10 to 12 interviews that Sonke Gender Justice and Wits University and the project Featured in Dipslit got out of this, where they were featured in the media. And they also got a lot of exposure on social media. And because they then invested so much time in this story, I, as a journalist, were much more likely to do another story about the work of them than with another organization. I felt that, I had to be reciprocal and that I owed them something, which brings me to the next bit on op-eds, because I'm going to talk about an op-ed that they then submitted to us. So when you want to appear in the media by writing an opinion piece, it's one way that you have control over the content. But because we in the online media world, it's no longer like in print media where you don't know if someone read a story on a certain page. You have actual figures that you can go and look at. And at Bhekisisa, we have very clear indications that just because you publish something doesn't mean that it will get readers. It needs to be in a very specific format. And the one thing about op-eds is that we get so many submissions for op-eds where researchers just think they need to address an issue because it's important. They would think, just write a piece about the importance of HIV testing, or the importance of medical male circumcision, or antibiotic resistance. And our statistics, our data metrics show us that people will read the first paragraph of a story like that, and then they'll move on to something else. How they will read it is when it addresses a very specific question, when you narrow that issue down. So, for instance, why do more men die of HIV than women when more women are infected with HIV? Or does alcohol lead to sexual violence? Or what is keeping people from accessing abortion services? I'm going to give you an example of that just now, but just having a piece about the general importance of why do we need to address sexual violence is not going to get any readers. And I often find that with researchers or communications people that it doesn't have a very successful or very specific news angle. Now at Bhekisisa, you'll see a link there that we have very specific guidelines on what we take and what we don't take for researchers. And we only accept about half or even less of the pitches that we get because we edit them so intensively. We spend about 8 hours on editing a piece, and then, you know, we work with a researcher and finding something that creating something that will really get read. But I find that in at least 60 to 70% of the cases, the researchers with the submissions haven't read the guidelines, and as a result don't get them accepted, or it's not something that we feel we can develop if you haven't followed those guidelines. Now, here's an example of an op-ed that did extremely well that we published, and it focused on that one question: why does HIV kill more men than women? We received this from Sanka Gender Justice, that is the organization that helped us with a deep split story. And we edited about 7 hours. I edited that piece myself. And why did we accept it? Because it had an argument. It needed a lot of work, but it had an argument and it had conflict in it. By conflict, I mean it's a very strong news value that makes people read it. If there's conflict in this piece was about why is it that more women than men get infected with HIV, but in the end there are higher numbers of men dying of HIV. It's a question that people want an answer to, and the conflict is the fact that more women get infected, but more men die. It is something that contradicts itself. So to give you an example of what was changed, you know, the thing with research is when you do research, it works exactly the opposite way when you publish a study than what it works in the news media. When you publish a study, you will end with the result of the research and you'll start with background. And in the media, it's the opposite way. You will start with the results and you'll end with the background, or maybe go back to the results at the end, but you'll work the background in some way in the middle. So, you also tend to use a little bit of jargon language. So with a story in the news media, it is really, really important to get to the point in the first 3 paragraphs, or you will lose readers. People will not continue to read that story. So, as you can see here, what we changed is, and the original copy, the intro was, young women still face a much higher risk of HIV infection than young men, but have significantly better long-term health outcomes and are more likely to survive than their male peers. Now, that is a paragraph that is too hard for competing online readers to understand and to follow. So we changed it to ordinary language and made the conflict more prominent. So to move on to the to a second last slide, something we did recently was to have a public discussion on a new HIV drug that was introduced in South Africa. The drug is called dolutegravir. It's not an entirely new ARV, but the way in which it was going to be used in South Africa was new. So it's part of our 3-drug combination, and it's now used as first-line treatment in the country. And on the left, you can see there is a woman on the left. She's called Michelle Moorhouse. She's a researcher who researched this drug. Next to her, there's a guy that sits next to me who is called Jürgen Pillay, who is basically the guy who runs South Africa's National Health Department. He's a Deputy Director General, but of most things. And then there is an activist called Yvette Raphael and another activist called Kanisa Boy. These people don't agree on things all the time, especially the 2 activists have very, very different opinions from the health department. And we wanted to get them all in one room to discuss this drug and complications of it so that there could be a constructive discussion about it, and journalists can also do stories about the outcome of that. So the issues with dolutegravir is that it brings down viral loads, HIV viral loads, much faster than the drug that it's replacing in a 3-drug combination in South Africa. But there are issues around a small increased risk of birth defects, and there are weight gain issues. And there are issues around what kind of contraceptive, what would be the quality of contraceptive counseling that a woman who can conceive who is on the drug should receive, and if she chooses to be on contraceptives, would there be a wide enough range of issues, which there are huge issues within South Africa. We've been contraception for the past 2 years, and there are not enough options to choose from. The options that are available on paper aren't available in clinics in reality. And we then had this, we had our deputy editor, Laura Lopez-Gonzalez, really led the story about dolutegravir in the country. It's hard to understand when it comes to the science. So it's hard for a non-health journalist to understand the issues around it. We then got all of these people together in one room. Yvette, the one activist, and Jürgen Pillay, the health department person, had huge disagreements before, but felt that, you know, the argument was moderated and presented in such a way that they had constructive discussion. You could imagine that Yvette was going to tell Jürgen that there isn't enough contraception available, and that dolutegravir, she wanted the drug to be available actually earlier in South Africa. There was a lot of bureaucracy about making it available. But in the end, they actually had, you know, pictures on social media together because they felt they had a good discussion. And it was an example of where the media could go a little bit further than just reporting on an issue, but also change the way in which people discuss an issue and promote their sort of constructive discourse around it. My last slide is about final tips. And that is really that if you're not on social media, I can't emphasize it enough, preferably Twitter, you will miss it all. You have to find ways in following what people say on social media, specifically policymakers and specifically journalists, if you want to know how to approach them. It's a very valuable tool because previously you may not have, before social media, you wouldn't have known what they were thinking about. But you can really use this to your advantage and also correct them if they're wrong on social media. And then if you wanted to submit op-eds, I know it must be very hard for a researcher to know how to write for a more general audience, but there are projects like The Conversation and Project Syndicate. There are hyperlinks on those slides. In both cases, you are able to click on them and see what their websites look like. That will spend, just like Bhekisisa, 7 to 8 hours on helping you create a piece and editing it. Then less is really more. One meaningful story can bring your research and make it far more impactful in the media than if you have little bits and pieces in many publications. And the fact that you have your own printing press. With a digital disruption, you have a website and you have social media channels, many of them. Use it to your advantage. You'll no longer only have to rely on the media to mainstream your research. You have tools available where you can do that yourself, and you can also, if you have a little article on the research on your own website, it's a tool of how to prevent inaccurate reporting, because you can actually get journalists to consult it, and you can do short videos on an iPhone where you talk about it and where people can take clips of it and use it in their reporting. We do that at Bhekisisa actually, where we will have short explainer videos about research or interview a prominent researcher to break down the research. And it's often happened that other media quote that video then. You know, they will go and listen to it and take a soundbite from there. Those are things that you can actually do yourself. You don't need a Bhekisisa to do it for you. That's it from my presentation.
Thank you so much, Mia. That was wonderful. There was so much that we got to hear and understand from there. For the participants, this is the time where you can start sending in your questions. There are a few questions which participants have already shared. I'm going to read out the first question for you, Mia. The question is that I work in the HIV field and I find that journalists are interested in cure of nothing. I'm struggling to communicate the importance of everything that happens in between. hopefully leading up to a cure. Any tips?
So I think that is a point that speaks to so many issues, because a cure is, of course, I wouldn't say the simplest thing that a journalist can think of, but it's the ultimate thing. You know, they want to have a black and a white situation, and it's either you're sick and then there's a cure, and there are so many nuances in between and things to understand. If I got a journalist like that and say, where's the cure? I would probably sit them down and explain a little bit broader than, what is in between. But I would first of all invest a bit of time in them. I would try to give them a few background materials, which I know you may say they may not read. I think the most important thing in a situation like this is to invest a little bit of time in that journalist, because what they can do with a view of just wanting to know about a cure can be so damaging. But I would also think that speaks to the need for training in the media world for journalists. And I often think that the trainings are often not basic enough. They're often if I see trainings presented by researchers, it's often very dense with 5 research, speaking in one day and trying to fit in a range of information. And the journalists often, the trainees, not being selected very strategically. I would think that speaks to trying to do shorter things for journalist trainings and trying to address more specific and more basic issues, because that obviously speaks to journalists, not understanding the entire range of HIV. Hope that helps. I don't know if that was a good answer.
Thank you, Mia. We have loads of questions coming in for you. The next one is, most of the research institutes have their own communication departments. So how this is going to work for the confidentiality issue or the confidentiality purpose?
Confidentiality of what? Of the people who were researched, or?
I think the participant wants to know that.
Right. I think it's probably the question is a little twisted here, but I guess it's more in terms of confidentiality of the subjects, probably, of those who have been researched or participants. Yeah.
So that confidentiality issue comes up so often, because it doesn't just come up with researchers. It comes up when you interview a doctor and you say, say if it's about measles, I need a patient with measles, they will also bring up the confidentiality issue. And I think it's something with more nuances in it than just a straight sort of like black and white answer. So first of all, when I have worked with doctors, there are some of them who have been willing to give me access to patients with their, informed consent. They would sign a form, and there's some who would be very strict and say no. That makes it very hard to tell the story. When it comes to research, it's obviously more complex, because the subjects can very often not be exposed to the journalists, because they really need to be protected from, that many people don't even know that they're involved in the research, and they sign agreements and stuff. I have never, I have often, if there's a big trial being done, been in a community and not necessarily interviewed one of the subjects in the research, but just people in the community who relate to that research. So there's obviously ways to get around that. But I've also been in a situation where I was given access to some of the subjects. Let me give you an example. There's a big HIV trial in South Africa, and when the first round of results, or the launch, when the trial was launched in South Africa by the Medical Research Council, they actually gave the media access to one of the participants. And the participant's name, as far as I could remember, was not mentioned. There was agreement from the media that it wouldn't be done, but they wanted to know, why would you be involved in a trial like that? To an HIV vaccine trial, and to sort of like address fears around, people had questions on whether wouldn't you get infected with HIV if you're involved in a trial that injects stuff in you. And I think they were very successful in addressing it around by giving people access to one person. I've never been in a situation where I revealed someone's identity when I was told not to do it. I understand that you can't possibly just go and give information to random journalists and think you can trust them. But if you have a personal relationship with a journalist, and it would make a story a lot stronger, and if there is informed consent, I think it is something to consider sometimes, to share that with one journalist that you can trust. Otherwise, there are definitely ways to get around this. You can certainly, as a journalist, speak to other people in the community about that trial. It doesn't necessarily have to be the subject. It can be about how people feel about the trial, or it can be about, how they feel about that subject that's being addressed. So there certainly are ways to get around confidentiality by either trusting a specific person and having rules that need to be stuck to, or by not giving a journalist access to those things and encourage them to talk to other people in a community.
Thank you so much, Mia. I guess that was really helpful. We have like a plethora of questions out there. On the same lines, I think I'm going to take up this one. There are definitely various guidelines that suggest that scientists or researchers should engage with journalists right from the beginning, especially in case of clinical trials. But however, that's rarely done. As someone working in Africa, where a lot of clinical trials are taking place, what are some of the repercussions of not engaging media right from the beginning that you have witnessed or are aware of? And how do you think people should engage media right from the beginning, and how soon is soon?
So, the obvious implication of not engaging media is that you're not going to get coverage. And when you do get coverage, you're going to get inaccurate coverage. And I would argue that no coverage is better than inaccurate coverage, because inaccuracies cause so much damage and lead to so many unfounded fears. So if I had to launch a trial in Africa, now I know that a trial very often takes place over a period of 10 years or 5 to 10 years, and that it would be hard to take a group of journalists with you over that period because they're going to move on to different jobs. But I find that specialist journalists tend to stay in the field for much longer than a general journalist. So if I look at just South Africa, people who were health journalists with me 20 years ago are still health journalists. They may be working at a different publication now, but they're still in the news media and they still work in the field of health. I would identify such senior journalists, a small group of journalists, and I would, when I launched that trial, educate them on the trial. I would give them sort of special privileges, they could have quicker access to a researcher than the general media. They would be able to have meetings with researchers that, that would be harder to get with general journalists. And I would meet with them every 6 months or every year, or just send them a brief update, not even always meet in person, and take them along on that journey, so that by the time that we get the results, I have a pool of people I have already established relationship with, and who would be far more likely and better equipped to report on that accurately. And I think one example would be HIV vaccine trials. It's so hard to understand vaccines. You get so many different types of vaccines. It's overwhelming science. And if you then have a group of journalists like that, if you want to retain them till the end, you're going to have to do things to keep them, on your side. So you may, for instance, give them access to a trial site, or to a lab where something is being analyzed, or to a special thing that happened, and perhaps other things in your organization. I think if you build a relationship like that, you're likely to have a good outcome. If I could use a recent example, for instance, at the Amsterdam HIV conference, the international conference, Obviously, if you're going to cover HIV in Amsterdam, something that you would have access to in Amsterdam that you won't necessarily have access to in other countries is sex workers, because sex work is legal there. So the conference wanted to get that issue covered. They felt very passionately about the fact that if you decriminalize sex work, it has a drastic impact on bringing down HIV infection rates. They didn't give all journalists access in that conference to talk to the sex workers, because you could imagine what would happen if someone is insensitive or report inaccurately or reveal someone's identity if they're not supposed to do that. They chose like 5 journalists from, that they knew, not necessarily just from prominent publications, but journalists that they had a relationship with from previous HIV conferences, and gave them access to it. And the coverage was really, really powerful as a result of that.
Thank you, Mia.
That would really be helpful to our researchers. The next question is, does the conversation cover stories, issues of national or subnational interest, say from India or South Asia? What are your thoughts on podcasts run or managed by academic research institutes?
I'm sorry, the sound cut out. Vanya, could you just repeat that?
Yes, so the registrant wants to know, what are your thoughts on podcasts run and managed by academic research institutes?
And broadcasts run and managed by academic research.
Yeah.
Podcasts. I think podcasts are an amazing idea. Absolutely. Which is why we've started to do them. I do, however, think that it would be it would be a little bit dumb to do podcasts if you haven't done research on them. So you need to know what type of podcasts people would listen to. So at Bhekisisa, for our audience, our research shows people do not want a podcast of longer than 10 minutes. So we try and keep our podcasts in that range. Our data shows that they like a Q&A with a researcher. One of our podcasts that have done probably the best of all podcasts was an interview with Salim Abdul Karim, who is an HIV researcher at Caprisa here in South Africa. And we did a 20-minute interview, and then because our data shows people only want 10 minutes, we split it. We cut it up into 2 10-minute podcasts, and made sure that it focused only on one thing in each podcast and promoted it that way. And it's done extremely well. And against our expectations, you would think that people don't want to listen to a researcher. They do. If that researcher explains it as well as Salim Abdul Karim did. And of course, we edited it. We didn't just go and record it and then we would broadcast it. We edited out the repetitive bits, or the bits, that didn't really relate so specific to what the subject of that podcast was. That works very well. I think journalists will go as far as, if you at a research institute have a podcast and they work for radio, if that sound is good, they'll probably take clips and put it. You'll probably end up in national media that way. But you, of course, will not end up in national media if you don't know how to promote that podcast. So and that will be social media. That is how the journalists will know about you. So if you do not know how to promote that podcast on Twitter, if you don't have data on how long that podcast should be, our data might be different from what people in India would want, then it's not going to work. And it doesn't help to have the podcast if no one knows about it. So it's very important. Do go and research podcasts in your country, see what people want, how long it should be, make sure it's good quality sound, and thirdly, make sure you know how to promote it.
Thank you, Mia, and our registrants are also thanking you for the lovely talk. Some of them want to know what is the target audience of Bhekisisa, and is Bhekisisa interested in covering stories, issues of interest from India and South Asia?
So thank you for that question. Our target audience is decision makers. So we aim to reach high-level politicians, we aim to reach academics, influential activists. We want to be able to help to frame policy through our media reports. So although that has changed a little bit with videos and stuff, you get a lot of younger people who are interested in that. But it would generally be young people, you know, who would probably have jobs that would become sort of like policy-making jobs eventually. So that's who we try to reach. If you look at our metrics figures, about 60% of our audience comes from South Africa, obviously. About 65%, 35% are from outside of South Africa, mostly from the US, from the UK, from the Netherlands, interestingly, from Nigeria, Kenya, and yeah, those are mostly the countries. We don't have so many readers from Asia. I think generally there's quite a divide between Africa and Asia issues because it's so far apart from each other. We're not always as informed about what each other do. As far as stories from India, we cover stories outside of South Africa, for instance, in other Africa countries, but it's a small percentage of what we do. We would be interested in India stuff, like, for instance, when it comes to ARVs, South Africa gets almost all of its ARVs from India. So, you know, lessons that we can learn in terms of patent laws, you know, producing generics, that's interesting to us, but it wouldn't be a large percentage of what we do. But our audience is certainly, with solutions journalism, very interested in what South Africa can learn from other countries, and that does not just have to be other African countries. It can be countries, you know, beyond our continent. We have, for instance, had a story of what South Africa can learn from climate change projects in Australia, and it was very, very well read. So it's not that we never cover these issues, but it's not a very large percentage.
Thank you so much, Mia, for sharing that with us. We have a lot of questions coming in. I just wanted to check with you if you're okay if we continue this for another 10 minutes so that we can take maximum.
Yeah, that's fine. It's fine.
Great. Great. So our participant asked, could you please share an example of how media was best involved for policy advocacy concerning sensitive population? And if you allow me, I might just add one more question to that, which is on similar lines. The question is that should it be the responsibility of the health personnel, I guess that's researcher, when it comes to disseminating research results for sensitive regional aspects?
Okay, I'm going to give you an example of a sensitive population. It's not a sensitive regional aspect, but it's a very sensitive issue in South Africa. So initiation that I mentioned at the beginning, and I'm going to give you an example of a story that had a huge impact on how it's done. So in 2013 or 2014, if I remember correctly, if you want to search the story's name is The Boys Who Lost Their Manhood. If you search that and you put my name next to it, then it will come up. So I went to the Eastern Cape. It was as a result of a doctor who got in touch with me from a very rural part of South Africa, where in the Xhosa population, where there was initiation, and he didn't just see people who died. He saw people who survived but who lost their penises. The doctors call that amputees. And he had 8 or 9 just in his village, men like that, and who couldn't talk about the issue because it was so stigmatized. And he wanted something to be done about it because no one addressed the issue. So he got in touch and gave me access to 7 men, amputees basically, who had either lost the entire penis or half a penis. And to tell the story around that, to look at how doctors could become involved in making traditional circumcision safer. And of course, there's all the advocacy around medical male circumcision that brings down a man's ability to acquire HIV by 60%. So what happened was I had access to the doctor, I had access to the men, and then I had access to studies that could talk about the advantages of medical male circumcision and how doctors could potentially be involved. Now, there's huge controversy about that in South Africa. It's very, very sensitive because, you know, a doctor who wasn't traditionally circumcised himself would not be able to be, it would have to be a man who helps. And it's seen as, you know, Western medicine trying to impose itself on culture. And that's why it's also was so hard to get the government in that part of the country involved in changing these things, because there's a lot of resistance, understandable resistance to it. So as a result of this story, the boys who lost their manhood, there were faces and people who spoke in a very powerful way of their lives, basically, that they can't speak about and how they were mistreated. It's not that everyone gets mistreated, but because of a lack of security arrangements and medical arrangements. The government, the Eastern Cape government, read that and was very upset. And the doctor made 120 copies of this article and distributed it at the Eastern Cape government. Within 2 weeks after publication, and because the story was, there was so much emotion in the sound bites and the quotes of these men that you couldn't ignore it possibly. And it was so prominently placed in the newspaper that it became a national issue. And as a result of that, the Eastern Cape government had a meeting with traditional leaders within 2 weeks after publishing the publication of the story, and also involved a medical male circumcision organization in the area in those meetings. And for the first time ever, the traditional leaders agreed to work with the organization, obviously not without complications. It's not as simple as it sounds, but a further impact of, and today in that area, a lot of boys, before they become men, are medically circumcised and then still go to the mountains, but doesn't get cut with a knife. They go through the other lectures and the meetings, and interactions with older men on how to become men. But more than that, what happened was the National Health Minister read it and then flew the doctor up to our capital, Pretoria, and asked him to make policy input in new legislation that was created for how to ensure safety in initiation camps. And more than that, what happened was Wits University here in Johannesburg read the story, and the drama department decided to write a play with literal quotes from the story in the play, and have the National School of Arts perform it to adolescent boys who would have to go through circumcision to become aware of these issues. And we then took 3 of the men who had penile injuries to go and see the play, and they felt that they got a voice and their experiences got validated. And as a result today, that story played a significant role in the creation of new legislation. It wasn't the only thing that played the role, obviously, but also in changing how circumcision initiation was done in that area. And interesting, we can't claim the credit for this, but in the end, about 2 years ago, South Africa performed the world's first penile transplant for an initiate who had lost his penis and was successful. Everything has gone well, and the guy is in a relationship today. And of course, we can't claim anything to do. We can just claim that we helped to create a conversation that could gather resources for something like that.
That was a wonderful, wonderful example, and it's really enriching to hear all the ground experiences that you're sharing, Mia. The questions don't seem to stop. I'm just trying to club a few questions together. The question is: trials are funded by networks, and they are skeptical about their trial cohorts and information shared before the trial completion, and they take full control of the trial processes as they own the protocol. So how are you going to work around that? The truth is, research institutes are really against staff interacting with media. And let me just see, your question is, right. Sorry, just 1 second. I'm just trying to. Okay. It seems that this is stuck, but if you could answer based on your experience on what. Yeah, the truth is the research institute are really against staff interacting with media. Remember, journalism is there for business. They might be providing misinformation about ongoing trial. I think what the participant is trying to understand is the mistrust and the fact that the protocols are controlled by sponsors, and how do you navigate through the sponsors?
So I'm not sure I have the perfect answer for that, but what I can say about sponsors, for instance, donors basically, is a frustrating part for me in the media often is that, some organizations we work with, if you want to do a story about their project, they would like, please mention our donor. And I would say, well, that's not my job. It's about what the project does, especially if it's a controversial donor or someone who's not very popular in South Africa. The Trump administration is not popular in South Africa. So if it's a US funded project, it always gets looked at through that lens sort of thing. So in those cases, I try to reach a compromise because I understand that you give me a good story and you will be in big trouble, if something, for instance, isn't mentioned. So one compromise example that what we had recently is we did a podcast actually about a sex worker project in South Africa and HIV. And we didn't mention the donor in the story, but we published the script of the podcast online. And at the end of it, we it wasn't part of the script. We mentioned it so that it's in writing and the organization can show the donor that it's somewhere. When it comes to communicating results of a trial, that deep slit story that I spoke about in the beginning, when we did the first deep slit story, so not the one I spoke about, the one that, that happened before this one, there was the study that they did, and they found that 56% of the men interviewed said they had raped or beaten a woman. And when we published that story, the community was immensely upset. I mean, they had protests. They were incredibly upset. And they felt it stigmatized them. It made Dipslit, it gave it a bad name. And we discovered afterwards that the reason they were so upset was because these results were not communicated to the community beforehand, before it was in the media. And I think together with a research organization, we learned the lesson that if you do research, you need to have a plan to first communicate results to the community before you give it to the media. You just can't go on having it widely known before you haven't had your plan. You need community meetings. You need to get the community's feedback so that it's not a shock by the time that it comes. Especially if it's quite shocking results like those results. So I think research organizations can't rely on the media to communicate a difficult message before it hasn't been communicated by themselves to the community. And that's something that I'm very aware of as a journalist now after that experience. When it comes to sponsors, protocols and roles, and they don't want you to interact with the media, I think it has to do with media literacy education, and it has to do with building trust. Again, I would not expect an organization that is hugely distrustful of the media to interact with the media at large. Just I would recommend that it's with one or two journalists that you have a relationship with and can trust, and that is how you will build trust with a sponsor around talking to the media about something. If you can use reports of that person that has had impact, it would help so much more. But I think there is a lot of media literacy education to be done among donors who just bluntly refuse to interact, because how will you get your information distributed? And I would imagine those same donors would also not want to be on social media, right? Because that's also now a media channel. And there's so much education and training to be done around that. Something that we actually do lately because of that situation.
Thank you, Mia. Thank you for sharing that experience with us. Really helpful. We'll take one last question here. What about social media influencers? What view you have on them, and do you have any relationship with influencers?
So when you say influencers, do you mean paid influencers? Do you mean we've got many ones who get paid?
Hasn't been very specific here.
But I guess what the participant intends to say is, like, we have TikTok stars, Instagram stars. I guess that's what they mean by social media influencers.
So, social media has so changed in how people communicate. So we have two examples in South Africa of two young Black women, actually not young, not that young, yeah, one is relatively young, doctors who are very successful advocates and who are huge social media influencers. So the example is, if you want to go on social media, Dr. Sindisiwe van Zyl and Dr. Tlaleng Mofokeng. And and Tlaleng Mofokeng is in the field of sexual and reproductive rights and feels extremely strongly about women's rights and that people should have access to safe abortions. Abortion is legal in South Africa, that the LGBTI community should be treated with dignity and respect. You know, their influence on social media, and how they would also, if we get something wrong in a report and one of them would respond to it, you know, where everyone would know we got something wrong. So what do I think of them? Bhekisisa values them and uses them. So as a result, I have specifically gone to Dr. Mofokeng and used her in a podcast, for instance, on age disparate sex, because I think people will take her so much more seriously than someone they don't know. We plan making HIV, for instance, how to use the HIV prevention pill, when should you use it? So I think we would be dumb to pretend that we live in a world where only researchers or doctors who publish in peer-reviewed journals are to be taken seriously. We don't live in that world. We live in a world where social media has become immense, and we need to take some of those people seriously. Obviously, there's the other side of this. You know, I'm not the anti-vaxxers, I'm not going to take seriously, or, you know, someone with, I'm going to take the influencers with the right information seriously. But I'm also going to make very sure, I think researchers have a responsibility, for instance, in the case of anti-vaxxers, to also use the social media channels that the anti-vaxxers use and distribute the right information. Often there's a lot of lessons we can learn from the wrong people, like the anti-vaxxer people, you know, on how to distribute information. They distribute the wrong information, but they're quite effective in it. And we can often draw lessons from that and sort of like counter them with their own tools.
Thank you, Mia. That was really insightful, and thank you for the lovely talk and joining us today. We still have questions coming in, but we would request our participants to send us the questions. We'll shortly share our email IDs with you, and probably we can then share them with Mia. And if she is okay with it, probably we can request her to send in the answers to us.
Sure, you can email me.
Yeah,
the email is on that. Okay. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you so much, Mia, and thank you everyone who joined us for today's webinar. Mia, your insights were very, very helpful, and thank you for making that very, very strong point that to counter misinformation, you have to present the right information using all the media platforms that exist there. A big thank you to all the participants. Like Banya shared, if you have any additional questions and would like to connect directly with us or the team, here are our email IDs. You can see them on the screen. We would love to hear your feedback. If there are any questions, we would love to hear back from you. Once again, a big thank you, and hope you guys had a wonderful time and have a wonderful rest of your day. Goodbye. Goodbye.
Bye.